Hello, everyone.
Just take a seat.
So thank you so much for coming to this second local history talk by the Brook Museum. And our speaker today is Sue Duckworth, who's talking about hopping in Kent. And Sue, she has 20 years of experience working as a librarian. In 2012, she started up a business called Fact or Fiction Tours, and she's a blue badge and a green badge tourist guide, and she specialises in giving talks about sort of focused on Kent and Sussex, and also walks and tours. And so she is kindly giving us a talk today. And she said she will take questions at the end if anyone has any questions about her talk. And after this talk, we'll be having a third talk next month, but I'll talk more about that at the end. But so for now, thank you so much for coming, and I'll hand over to Sue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippa. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent. Can you all see the slide there? Excellent. Right. Just to add a little bit to what Philippa was saying, I live in Smeeth, so I only live just down the road with my husband and my dog, and I enjoy walking. I enjoy the countryside, and I enjoy recently really playing music as a member of the Romney Marsh Morris dance side. So that's quite a recent thing really, but it's a bit of fun really, isn't it? So I'm going to be doing a talk on hopping in Kent this evening, and my talk will begin really with quite a lot of information about the history of hop growing, how and why hops were grown in Kent, and then it will continue with the story of hop picking in Kent, so how hops were picked. I've tried also to make it as up-to-date as possible too. So the first slide that you can see here is the Hop Exchange in London. It's a Grade 2 listed building. What you can see there isn't the whole of the original building. Some of it's disappeared. It was opened in the 19th century and designed by a man called R.H. Moore. But it did serve as the centre for hop trading and for the brewing industry, obviously, but was in London. Its purpose was to provide a single market centre for dealers in hops. And originally it would have had a glass roof, which allowed natural light to flood into the building. And then the business could be conducted under natural light. So there were other exchanges in London as well as the Hop Exchange, such as things like the Coal Exchange and Metal Exchange, but the wartime bombing, World War II bombing, fires in London and the redevelopment and modernisation of the city have left the Hop Exchange here the only one that still stands. A massive fire, however, in 1920 destroyed the top 2 stories, and so it's now offices, which is why you can see this sports car at the front of it. Right, straight to Romney Marsh, in fact. This is the Red Lion. I don't know if any of you ever been to the Red Lion or not. It's a very interesting old pub with a very unique feel because it hasn't really changed much in the last 100 years. So ale was first imported to England around the late 14th century, and it was actually the original beverage of the Anglo-Saxons, who of course lived here after the Romans left, and the English. The original purpose of adding hops to ale was to ensure that the ale would keep for longer. But adding hops, it also improved the flavour and the fragrance of it. In general, there were actually 3 main areas where hopping took place in England. They were Kent and East Sussex, Herefordshire and Worcestershire, and North East Hampshire. And that's really the only places in England that hopping actually took place. So here's a lovely picture of an apple orchard, which is not that far from Faversham, really. Codneo is near Faversham. Why was Kent really suitable for hops? Everyone's heard, or possibly everyone's heard the saying, Kent, sir. Everybody knows Kent. apples, cherries, hops and women. This is a famous quote from Charles Dickens, of course, from the Pickwick Papers. But it was the Flemish brewers who introduced hops for brewing into Kent in the 16th century. And Kent was really the earliest place in England because of its suitable soil here, really. It's enclosed field system. It's very good supply of wood from the Weald of Kent for poles and also charcoal to dry the hops. So the Kent farmers, they were also supposed to have been some of the richest in the country. And that's because they could afford, or because of the fact that they were so rich, they could actually afford the high initial capital outlay because they were so well off. The first English hop garden, and we must call it a garden, not a field, is thought to have been created either at Westbere near Canterbury in 1524 or at Little Chart nearer Ashford in 1520. So here is a hop garden at Little Scotney Farm in Kent. And this is obviously, as you can see, at the time when the hops are not being grown. So they've already been harvested at this time. So hop plants, they are perennials, and they were traditionally grown on hills up poles that were around 10 feet high. Each mound, each hill, had 3 poles for 3 plants, and a man, a local man actually, called Reynolds Scott, became Sir Reynolds Scott. He wrote a farming manual as long ago as 1574, which was called A Perfect Platform of a Hop Garden. This covered all the technical aspects of how to grow hops, and it went on to become the standard, really, the standard manual on hop growing. He was a Kentish squire, so one of those very well rich men, and he inherited and farmed land at Smeeth and Brabourne. Henry Butcher of Sheldwich near Faversham, he was the one who introduced the idea of wire work, but that wasn't for a long time, till the 1900s, really, the 19th century. So in this, the poles were spread out and joined by wires at the top, middle and bottom. The poles were 25 feet high and made of chestnut or ash, and that's what you can see here, really. Men on stilts, they were called stilt men, they began working months before the pickers arrived. The stilts were originally made of wood too, but they became very heavy to move in wet weather. So the later ones, they were made of hollow aluminium. Stiltmen tied coir, which is like a kind of a tough coconut fibre, to the top wires to train up the bines, which are what the plant stems are called. And in dry weather, they would put up netting to protect the hops that were growing from the sun. The stilts that they used, they were 13 feet high, and a man needed a ladder to reach them. So using leather belts, they actually fixed on the stilts around their ankles and thighs. So that's how they got up onto them and fixed them on. So now we're going to have a look at the hops over the years, because I said that they started being planted in the 16th century, and originally that would have been in monastery gardens, really. But we're going to go through a look through some of the centuries now. So starting with the 17th century, and this is a hop garden that you can still see today at Kent Life near Maidstone. So as I said, beer was established really by the end of the 16th century, and by now hop growing had spread rapidly. Hop gardens actually changed when the hills that had been originally used were reduced in size by almost a half. They were also then manured with earth from dunghills, soap ashes and bracken, and the reason for that was because these things were all rich in potash, which was very important for the hops. Most of the manual work was carried out by contract for an agreed price. This was often around 40 shillings per acre. However, the pulling, the picking and the drying and the bagging, which then took place once the hops were ready, that was carried out and charged for instead by the day. It's said that an acre of good hops could produce 550 to 600 kilograms, which could fetch in those days as much as £40 or £60, which in the 17th century was an awful lot of money. The dried hops were put into 2 1/4 hundredweight bags and sold at local fairs. By 1655, so the middle of the 17th century, hops were grown in 14 different English counties, but Kent still produced a third of the crop. So very important around here. So this is a picture of the Borough Market today in London. But even with all these hops that were being grown, there were still not enough to satisfy the demand, and so we had to import Flemish hops. Some farmers actually refused to grow hops because of the erratic yields, which were caused by drought, wet periods and mildew. However, in a successful year, an acre of good hops could be far more profitable than 50 acres of arable land. Towards the end of the 17th century, beer began to be bottled in quantity. There were various different varieties of hops at this time, but there were no names given to them. There were also some attempts at pest control, with many plants being sprinkled with water in which wormwood had been boiled. A hop market was established at Little Eastcheap, but later moved to the Borough in southeast London, as it was more convenient for the Kentish growers. So originally at Borough Market there would have been a hop market, but that was of course the days before the market that I showed you earlier, the hop exchange. That was much later. So we're now moving to the 18th century, and this is a mural really on a wall of the Stourbridge Fair, which was a very important one. In the 18th century, duty was imposed on hops for the first time. This was at a rate of a penny per pound on English hops and threepence really per pound on the Flemish hops. So only a penny for English, but threepence for the Flemish ones. The duty was very successful in getting a lot of tax, large revenue really in from year to year, and this actually was something which appealed to the gambling folk of the 18th century. So speculating on the hop tax became a popular form of betting. Import duty encouraged smuggling, of course, and from 1734, the penalty for illegally exporting was not only the destruction of the hops that you'd smuggled, but also a fine of 5 shillings per pound of the hops that were confiscated. The annual yield varied from 2 to 1,500 weight per acre, but this obviously would have depended on the weather, the pests and the diseases that were about for that year. The writer Daniel Defoe noted huge hop gardens around Maidstone and Canterbury. The Sturbridge or Stourbridge Fair in Cambridgeshire was the main fair in England, which specialised in the sale of hops and wool. The price of hops was governed by the price that was agreed at Sturbridge, and it was readily available by water both from the north and the south, although quite far away from the main hop-growing counties. By the year 1765, hops were sold at 25 fairs in England and Wales. So this is a hop garden in Herefordshire. Kent was still producing more hops than any other county, and there they started to plant fruit trees in the alleyways between the hops. Once the trees began to mature and produce apples, then the hops were removed, and this practice continued right up to the 20th century. By 1750, paler beer began to come into fashion, and the lighter coloured hops from Farnham in Surrey began to be favoured by the brewers. Many Kentish farmers replaced their Canterbury hops with the Farnham variety. Kent hops were used in beer, they say, for keeping. So if you wanted to keep your beer longer, you needed a Kent hop. Whilst beer containing Worcester hops had to be drunk within a month to 6 weeks because it just wouldn't last. According to Nathaniel Kent, who was a land valuer and agriculturalist, a successful crop of hops required a great deal of attention and a lot of manure. Hereford and Worcester farmers used their farm manure on the hop yards at the expense of their arable land. Kent farmers, however, thought this was foolhardy, as arable land profit was more certain than that of the hop garden, they said. This is a hop pocket at Kent Life. In 1774, an act was passed to prevent frauds in marketing. This required the bags or the pockets that you can see here in which the hops were packed to be marked with the year, the place of growth and the grower's name. So growers began to mark their own pockets with stamps and stencils, and many devised their own symbols. The late 18th century focused attention on different varieties such as Williams and Jones. The famous Golding hop was discovered, and the Farnham and Canterbury white vines displaced some of the older varieties. Hops were manured every 3rd year with woolen rags, which were brought in from London. This cost around £5 per tonne and was spread at about 1 tonne per acre. The consumption during this century of hops was considerable, and in some years, a million barrels of beer were brewed in London and the suburbs just alone. 4 pounds of hops were used per barrel, which is more than twice the present use today. This is a picture of St Botolph's Church in Chevening in Kent. So we're now moving to the 19th century. So the 19th century really was the golden age of the hop industry. In 1800, there were 35,000 acres of hops in Great Britain, and just 50 years later, there were 50,000 acres. Then in 1862, the hop duty was removed. It had been 1.5 to 2p per pound. And by 1870, hops were being cultivated in 40 English, 8 Welsh and 5 Scottish counties, although still most acreage was in Kent. In 1878, the hop acreage reached its peak with 71,789 acres. However, by the year 1900, the acreage had started to decrease and fell back to 50,000 acres. Early in this century, the 19th century, Mr. Colgate from Chevening in Kent, he developed the Colgate hop from a specimen which was growing wild in a farm hedge at Chevening. That's why it's called the Chevening hop. But other popular varieties included Golden Tips, the Canterbury grape and the Mayfield grape. Later, the famous Fuggle grape hop was grown. This was a mid-season hop of good size and quality, which was actually grown in the Weald of Kent. It was said to have come from a seed that was thrown out with some crumbs from a hop picker's dinner basket on the farm of a man called George Stace of Horsemondon in 1861. It was later introduced as a commercial variety by Richard Fuggle in 1875. Profits in hop growing were still erratic, however, and fortunes could be made or lost with hop gardens. Here's a more local picture. This is Rye Town Hall. Jeremiah Smith, who was 7 times the mayor of Rye, was one of the largest hop growers in England, and it's said that he paid £33,462 in hop duty between 1850 and 1862. 1862 was the year when the duty was repealed. He farmed 1,200 acres in Kent and Sussex for over 20 years at an estimated rental of £4,000, but the decline in the value of hops contributed to his bankruptcy. In 1827, the cost of a new hop garden was between £80 and £90 per acre, but that was just for the first year. After that, it dropped to between £30 and £40 per year. The hops were planted in rows 8 feet apart, with 6 feet between the hills, and 3 or more plants per hill. Further attempts in this century were made to solve the flea beetle issue and aphid, but none of these were effective. Wireworms could be lured away from the tender hops by burying half a potato each day, which obviously is quite hard work, really. But in 1850, it was found that dusting the hops with sulphur helped to control the mould. This was a horrible job, and the resulting thick, sticky stains were removed from the hands using crushed hop leaves. A clumsy horse-drawn powdering machine was then invented to propel the sulphur over the hops so that they could cover the hops in it. Horrible powder. So this is a picture from the Brook Rural Museum, just down the road. It's a Nidget, that's what it is, and I'll tell you what that is in a minute. So newly planted hop gardens, they were often ploughed to a depth of 16 inches with a strong plough, perhaps pulled by 10 horses. But as you can imagine, that would damage a garden or the plants. After the first ploughing, only the horse nidget, which is a smaller triangular cultivator with a number of harrow-type prongs which can be drawn by just 1 or 2 horses. That was the only thing that was allowed in the hop garden. The nidget, however, could not get close enough to the hop plants, so the areas around them had to be hoed with a small short-handled hop hoe and dug over by hand with what was called a spud, which was a heavy three-pronged fork. Digging, hoeing and nidgeting often had to be done as many times as 8 times in a season. The season didn't really start till April and ended in September, so it wasn't a very long season either. So 8 times within that period of time. The most important development of the 19th century really was the system of training the hops. Chestnut was usually used for the hop poles, which in the middle of this century they cost £1 per 100. 4,000 poles were needed per acre, but they had a limited life as creosote hadn't been invented until 1862. And even then there were many objections to creosoting the lower parts of the poles. So estates and plantations of regularly coppice chestnuts were maintained for a regular supply of hop poles. And such coppices in the southeast of England still do provide today many of the larger chestnut poles which are used for the wire work in the hop gardens. There's another local picture, Y College. Several training systems were tried before it was realised that the most simple and economic method was, of course, the wirework system that was introduced by Henry Butcher of Sheldrich in 1875. And this system became very popular in East Kent. Although the poles are higher, the overall pole density is less, so there's fewer poles. Horizontal wires were attached to the chestnut poles near ground level, then also at breast level and at the top of the poles. The hop bines then spiralled up the coir strings which were taken from the bottom wire to the breast wire and then sloped across the alley to the top of the neighbouring row. To speed the tying of the strings to the top wires, a horse-drawn trolley with an elevated platform was used, or especially in Kent, the stringers walked on high stilts. Henry Butcher's method quickly became very popular and the system soon spread to all hop areas. In 1884, it cost around £50 an acre to install his system. The system is still used by 1 or 2 growers in East Kent, although slightly modified to suit machine picking. And the old-fashioned pole system lingered in some areas until the 1970s, so not that long ago at all. But moving to the 20th century, this is a Brook hop processing machine which is near Toodley, near Tunbridge. So by 1909, hop acreage had fallen to 32,000 acres, which was less than half of that 25 years earlier. Of course, during World War I, brewing was considerably reduced. To avoid a huge surplus, the government further restricted land under hops and introduced a system of hop control which remained until 1925. But to provide some protection for the industry, a customs duty of £4 per hundredweight was imposed on foreign hops. In 1932, the Hop Marketing Board was created, which was producer controlled, and this ensured a sheltered market for the producers. 14 members were elected annually by the hop growing districts, with 4 special members being elected by hop producers and 2 nominees of the Ministry of Agriculture. In 1985, the board was restructured and this became English Hops Limited. The English hop picking machine was made in 1934, but it did not begin to threaten the way of hop picking by hand until really after World War II, when it became accepted in the Midlands first of all. It is now used in most hop gardens as it allows picking to continue in all weather conditions. The bines are cut 2 feet above the ground and then a crow's nest attached to a tractor-drawn trailer carries a cutter which slashes the strings from the overhead wires. The bine and the string fall into the trailer below, which is then driven to a covered picking plant. So this is what you can see here. The bines are hung on a continuously moving overhead track, taking them into the picking machine, which plucks the hop from the bine and sends them through a system of conveyor belts and rollers. Eventually, the hops are emptied into a poke, which is a bag which contains 10 bushels, and then into the oast or drying unit. Permanent wire work, such as the Worcester or umbrella system, where the strings are banded in out of the way of the tractors, have now been established. And the stilt walker may still carry out maintenance work nowadays, but not the stringing anymore. So this is called the Fuggle Hop Bower, which is in a place called Otley Hall in Suffolk. I believe it's a wedding venue, so this is a nice place for a couple to sit under the bower here. The Fuggle variety almost died out and owes its survival in part to the campaign for real ale. But brewers now use high alpha hops. Those are those with improved bittering quality, provided by new varieties such as the local Y Target, rather than the old traditional ones. And also much progress has been made in the design of drying kilns. Hop growers have invested in sophisticated equipment such as a 3-tier batch dryer or continuous dryer. Some drying plants consist of a chamber where each tier can be loaded with hops 18 inches deep, so that when the dryer is fully loaded, the equivalent of 4'6" of green hops will be drying at a time instead of a normal 18 inches to 2 feet in a traditional kiln. So you can do 4 times as much basically. Processing hops into extracts or pellets is another important development. Hop extracts, they were first made in the UK in World War I, and since the 1980s, because of the high cost of storage, handling and transport, only 1/3 of the hops produced are used in their natural state today. This is a field of dwarf hops in Herefordshire. To economise on the high cost of setting up a hop garden and harvesting it, some new varieties are now being bred to a height of only 8 feet. In recent years, the traditional hop varieties are regaining favour, and some other growers are beginning to operate a system of 10 feet high trellis work, which has economic advantages while still using traditional hop varieties. So hop research, the College of St Gregory and St Martin in Wye, was established to train secular priests originally and to educate local boys in the attached grammar school. Known as Wye College, it was founded in 1447 by Cardinal Kemp of Ollantay Park in Wye, who went on, of course, to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. In 1890, the buildings, however, were bought by Kent and Surrey County Council, and the South Eastern Agricultural College was established. This became part of the University of London, later Imperial College. But then in 1947, the Hop Research Department was established here, with 50% of its funds coming from the Agricultural Research Council, 25% from the Hops Marketing Board, and 25% from the Brewers Society. After 100 years, Wye claims to have the oldest and probably the most highly respected hop research unit in the world, with its greatest success being in breeding new varieties. Now the nice picture of Wye. Professor Salmon joined the college in 1906 and he was soon involved in breeding the hops. He bred varieties such as Brewer's Gold, Bullion and Northern Brewer. It was estimated by 2005 that over half of all of the hops grown commercially worldwide were descended from his original seedlings. Ray Neave succeeded Salmon in 1953 and he bred varieties such as Y Northdown, Y Challenger and Y Target. In 1981, Peter Darby took over the programme and concentrated on dwarf hops, aphid-resistant hops and the flavour. At that time, the college's breeding programme was producing 30,000 plants a year to evaluate. When Imperial College sought to close their Y campus in 2007, hop research activities transferred to Y Hops Limited, a subsidiary of the British Hop Association, with the collections moving from Y to China Farm Upper Harbledown, where they remain as of 2022. So now we're going to be moving on to picking the hops. So it's only the female plants which have flowers. They are pale green flowers which are called cones. So you can see some of these cones here. These are actually from Norfolk. The hops begin to flower in July, and by September the cones are ready to be picked from the vines. So before machinery arrived, hop picking was of course done by hand, and it was very labour intensive. The picking season was also very short, so there were never enough people locally to do the job. Hundreds of people therefore came from London and other parts of the southeast to pick each September. All hands were needed for the job, no matter how small, so when school became compulsory for children in 1880, the school year was arranged around hopping. So this fountain is in Victoria Park, and Victoria Park is known as the People's Park. It's in the Tower Hamlets area of London. And the fountain here, the Baroness Angela Burdett Coote Memorial Drinking Fountain, was built in the 19th century at a cost of £5,000. It was a gift from the wealthy philanthropist, Baroness Angela Burdett Coote. She was, of course, the daughter of the Coote's banking empire. And water would pour from 4 cherubs' vases and silver-plated cups, which were attached to chains, which allowed the poor EastEnders, really, the East Londoners, sanitary drinking water. That was the only sanitary drinking water they would have. For many East Londoners, this was a first, as previously they'd had to drink from dirty, filthy bathing lakes. During Victorian times, the East End of London was one of the poorest parts of London, and many people lived in run-down accommodation, sometimes with whole families living in one room. The factories and the busy port nearby meant that the East End was polluted. In the summertime, with the heat, the crowded conditions and the pollution, it was not a nice place to live. There was, of course, in those days, no welfare, and many folk had to do extra jobs, 2 or 3 jobs each, just to keep the wolf from their door and pay the rent. Everything was aimed at the promise of going hopping at the end of the year. So here's a picture of some hop pickers. This pediment was carved by William Forsyth, and this is from Worcestershire, Sansom Street in Worcester. And this was the office of a man called Samuel Meyer, who was a hop merchant. Each summer, the farmers would send out their letters to the regular pickers from London, inviting them to come down and work. Once they received their letter, people with jobs, they often had to get time off work. Quite often this would involve going to the doctors and getting a sick note, and start to prepare for the trip. So here we have a gentleman who said, "We waited all summer for the letter from the farmer to say if we could go. We were always glad when we knew it was okay. I was 6 when I first went with my Aunt Rose and my 2 older brothers. It was September 1939 and war had just been declared." So this is a slide of the Southern Railway Express locomotive called Tangmere. So it's something that Shepherd Neame, the brewer in Faversham, often arranged for the annual Faversham Hop Festival. And the picture you've got here is of the Spitfire Hop Pickers Special about to depart from Faversham station for a return trip to Sheerness on the Isle of Sheppey. So it was part of the Faversham Hop Festival. So when the day came, the families from London, they would carry their hopping boxes, which included clothes not fit for everyday use, dried and tinned food, and the essential oil lamp to London Bridge Station. For many children, this was their annual holiday, and the trip down to Kent was an adventure. They would see cows and fields which were never seen in London. The hoppers' special steam trains ran at unusual hours, so they didn't interrupt the main service. When the pickers arrived at the other end, the farmers would send down wagons to collect them and their belongings and bring them to the farm. Other ways of travelling to Kent could include by lorry, bicycle, or even by Shank's pony. So another picture from Southwark in London. This is the former Hartley jam factory. Hartley's opened this jam factory in 1902, but has since been converted into luxury apartments. Families would pack up their food, their crockery, their clothing, their bedding, and everything they could possible to make their stay in Kent more comfortable. They would often take curtains to hang over the doors of their huts for privacy. Sometimes the farmer's letter or invitation they got would include a train ticket. Otherwise, they would have to walk or catch the Hopper's Special train, which cost 2 shillings and sixpence. That was an awful lot of money in those days. So a lady called Nell said some of the mums put their children in hopping sacks under their seat on the train so they didn't have to pay their fares. When the ticket man came round, you'd hear them whispering, "Shut up now or I'll bet you one." Bob said hopping was cancelled for a few years when Dolly and Joan, my twin sisters, were born in 1940. But when we started again, there were 3 families in our block of flats which went, and we all waited eagerly to see who got their letter first. There was our family, the Tylers and the Lynchers. We were sent assisted train tickets and our hut and bin numbers with the letter. We left Vauxhall Street at about 5 a.m, pushing hopping boxes and carts through Lambeth Walk to London Bridge Station. If we were lucky, we'd find an empty compartment, and Aunt Bob got us kids to hang out the window and do our whooping cough act to keep it to ourselves. Hop picking was a good way to earn money pre-war. I was 10 years old the first time. A neighbour of ours, her husband had a terrible accident in the docks. She asked my mother if we could go with her. It was me and my sister. She was 12. We had to leave at 12 o'clock at night to get a train from London Bridge. We pushed a big pram and cart all the way. It was really exciting because I'd never been hopping before. So here's a picture of the Guildhall in Faversham. And this little bit now about the local pickers, because not everyone came from London. Lots of people picked locally too, people from Faversham, for example. Before the Second World War, pickers were recruited locally in places such as Faversham. Agents were paid to sign up what they called a basket or a picker, the sum of 1 shilling, so it's quite lucrative being an agent. After the war, farmers advertised in the local paper, and the Faversham News of the 6th of August 1948 stated, "Hop picking. I would be pleased to hear from old and new baskets who intend coming this year," and that was from E.B. Curling of Perrycourt Farm. As summer continued, the locals would make their own preparations for hopping. They found the stools, the chairs and the baskets that were hidden away, and they renovated them. Town criers used to shout out instructions and starting dates for particular farms, as well as the locations where the baskets would be left on the day prior to the start of picking. So now we're going to have a look at living conditions. So these slides are from Kent Life. One of them on the left is the interior of a hut, and the other one on the right is a cookhouse where the pickers used to have their evening meal really around it. So pickers' huts, they were usually constructed of tin, like the one you can see on the left here. Brick, if you were very lucky. They were often arranged in a block so the pickers could share washing and cooking facilities and a communal toilet. The Londoners, they wanted to have the fires outside and the communal cooking outside, but there was very little health and safety in those days, and tragedies did sometimes occur. At May's farm, Ethel recalled when a couple put their children to bed and went off to the pub. Instead of putting a twig in the hasp of the door, they padlocked it, and when fire broke out, the children burnt to death as nobody could get to them. These are some more tin huts, but these ones were originally at North Frith Farm in Hadlow, and they've been moved, reconstructed and moved. After they've been moved, they've been reconstructed and put at Kent Life. Most pickers did bring their belongings with them to make their huts feel like home. Some even covered them in wallpaper. Faggot beds were made up using sticks, and whole families shared one room for their 6-week stay. If tin huts or brick huts weren't available, the pickers were sometimes accommodated in old animal sheds or even tents. Sulphur candles were burnt in the huts to kill off infestations of fleas and lice. It wasn't a very healthy place to be in one of these huts. Now we'll be looking at a day in a hop garden. So here you can see, this is again from Herefordshire. This is a mural at the Hop Pocket Craft Shop. It's been painted of what you can see of them picking there in a hop garden. So you've got the oasts there in the background. Tallymen issued hop tokens or recorded tallies, that's how many you've picked really, using either a book, a tally card or a wooden tally stick. For each bushel you picked, a notch was made on both the tallyman and the picker's tally stick. The tallyman or the measurer's role was often, as well as doing that, to keep order in the hop garden and to ensure that labourers were not paid over the odds. No half baskets were accepted whatsoever, except on a Saturday when they finished earlier. Farmers could, at their discretion, offer a sub to workers, but some hoppers subbed all their earnings, going home with nothing for their efforts. However, quite a few of them would save carefully to buy their children's clothes, boots or Christmas goodies. So again, these pictures are from the Brook Agricultural Museum. So stilts, which you can see in the left-hand one, they were the things that were used for elevated work in the hop gardens, particularly for early work in the hop garden. An alley bodge or hop dolly that you can see here on the right here was a miniature wagon which used to transport manure down the alley. So they would push that or they would have it pulled by a horse down the alleyways between the hops. And it could be pulled by a horse in either direction. So there are a couple of things that if you visit the Brook Agricultural Museum, you'll be able to see. It's full of exciting things like that. So these ones are from Faversham Museum. So we have some hop tokens on the right-hand side, some tally sticks there, look like rulers, and a hop picking book from Sindale Farm, which is still producing hops today, Sindale Farm. So the tokens were used as a receipt for the number of bushels picked, because you didn't actually get paid until right at the end of the picking season, which was about 6 weeks long. The baskets that you picked into were made of cane and they would hold a bushel of hops, which was about 36 litres. But people used any type of container they could find, such as a half sieve, an umbrella, even a tin bath was used. The day would normally start at 7 a.m. and they would work till 5 in the afternoon. You would be called in or called off half an hour before the end of the picking to allow you to finish the bushel you were picking. Dinner time would last an hour and was usually announced by the blowing of a whistle. Earnings might average out to around £1 a week in old money, but the pay really did vary. John wrote, "We did our shopping from various vans which called on the hop field during the day. The grocers and the butchers came. The bakers sold huge lumps of bread pudding. But you never knew what you were going to be paid for a bushel because it depended on the size of the hops. If the summer was dry, the hops were smaller. But in a wet one, they might be quite big. So you never knew how much you actually had to come until the end of the picking time." So you couldn't spend too much because you didn't know what you were really earning. So this is an unconverted oast house near Sturry in Canterbury. So the drying process, once the hops are picked, this is how they went about drying them. So once they'd been picked from the plants, they were taken to the oast house. Here they were dried, cooled and packed up, ready to be sold to the brewery. Drying was a 24-hour process, which meant that the staff who were involved in the drying, they had to sleep in the oast house. The oast house contained the kiln, and sulphur would be added to the fire to impart a special flavour to the beer and a yellow tint which the brewers wanted, but it was not very healthy for the workers. An oast house worked a little bit like a tumble dryer does today. A fire beneath the roundel heated the hops. The cowl on top of the oast house, which you can see the white cowl on top of this one, was shaped like a cylinder. It was rotated by a wind vane which allowed air to circulate in the roundel, and the cowl also allowed moisture to escape. So a bit more local now. This is Court Lodge Oast House in Brook. So I'm sure you all know that Ashford really wasn't a prime area for hop growing, but the village of Brook actually did have some hop acreage. So there were actually 2 oast houses for drying hops in Brook. This one, Court Lodge Oast House, which dates to 1815, and another one near Sankey House in Brook, which was also built in the early 19th century. A local tithe map of Brook lists hops being grown at Sankey Farm, Bedleston Farm and the top of Spelders Hill, with a total of 10 acres of hops being grown in the village. Court Lodge is of course part of the Agricultural Museum today, whilst the other oast house, has been converted into a dwelling. But today Court Lodge, the oast house you can see here, is one of the most original oast houses remaining from the days of hop picking. And that's really because most of the oast houses have been converted into dwelling houses, and of course that changes them quite significantly. Many of the tools and the machinery used in Brook and the surrounding areas can be seen in the adjoining museum. And this is the inside of the Court Lodge Oast House in Brook. So one of the things that people often say is why are some oast houses round and why are some of them square? In the early 19th century, it was widely accepted that the introduction of round kilns was the work of John Reed of Horsemondon in the High Weald of Kent. Mr. Reed, he invented the circular kiln, and he claimed that double the quantity of hops could be dried in it compared to a square kiln of similar dimensions. New types of furnaces, which used circular hot water pipes to heat the kiln, may also have stimulated the building of round kilns, as the heating system fitted more neatly into a round space than a kiln with squared off walls. This oast house here, Court Lodge Oast House in Brook, is particularly interesting, however, as it has an internal wall which is aimed at improving heat distribution. So you can see the wall there on that slide. This is a brick inverted cone wall which actually allows 4 furnaces in a central ring, which allows the heat to spread more evenly. So this is the Alma Public House, Painters Forstall near Faversham. And when the hop pickers, they were picking hops during the day, they needed, of course, to entertain themselves in the evening. So the Alma Public House was one of the places they went to. The building has been a pub since 1837, and it was originally known as the Candle House. The reason it was called that was because the landlord used to put candles in the windows to guide the hop pickers to his establishment. So he was quite keen on getting the hop pickers in there. After the day's work, the hoppers would either visit the local pubs such as the Alma, or they'd gather round their campfire. They would congregate in groups, sometimes around a musician, playing a concertina or a mouth organ. There would be some step dancing and a lot of singing. The pubs would usually be full. So, the happiest times were weekends when the family came down. We'd all go off up to the village green to the pub for the evening. When the publican turned us out, we'd all walk back down the lane, singing all the way to the hop farm. There wasn't any fear of getting knocked over in those days. I'm just going to read you a song, really. I'm not going to sing it, don't worry. This is by a man called Bob Kenward, who is a very popular, well-known songwriter of Kent. And it's from the book The Hop Bin by Fran and Jeff Dole. And it's all about hopping, really. The hop time comes and we must go on the southern line, crammed in a carriage away from the smoke, and how the sun do shine. Paddock Wood we sit and stare, Horsemondon we're almost there. How we sniff at the country air and the straggling bine. It's off at Goudhurst by the mill on the southern line. Half a mile to climb the hill, and how the sun do shine. To the hut and through the door, drop your suitcase on the floor, just like home to see once more the straggling bine. The pull and push runs like a clock on the southern line, telling us that it's time for work, and how the sun do shine. Out into the gardens green, pick a bushel and keep it clean, as many leaves in as can't be seen from the straggling bine. Sundays Dad comes for a spin on the southern line. He goes home as tight as sin, and how the sun do shine. We work among the gardens here, where sky is blue and air is clear, to make his pot of Docker's beer from the straggling bine. Every morning brings the goods on the southern line, struggling through the fields and woods, how the sun do shine. Every kid from London town loves to run these gardens round, hiding where he can't be found in the straggling bine. Its pockets packed and carried in trucks on the southern line. Scrub in a bucket and brush yourself up, and how the sun do shine. Sing and sup the hopper's toast, kiss the one you love the most. Say ta-ta to the farmer's oast and the straggling bine. It's down to the mill, we'll all go home on the southern line. Cots and prams and kettles and stoves, and how the sun do shine. Horsemondon, Paddock Wood, back to the smoke and the neighbourhood. Dad says the air must have done you good in the straggling bine. Oops. So during the time that the pickers from London were here, many of them faced a lot of issues with health and sanitation in the hop gardens. So in the 19th century, churches started to run missions to help save these people, really. So this is a picture of the Well Hill Mission Church in the Darrants Valley. So ladies who were dressed up and then they would in the dress of the day, really, which would have been laundered blouses and ankle-length skirts and straw boaters. They came to the hop gardens, bringing with them little three-wheeled barrows loaded with jugs and mugs of hot tea and coffee, buns and cakes. In East Kent, they began work in the Canterbury area around Harbledown and Selling, taking their wheelbarrows to the hop gardens morning and afternoon. This is Yalding village sign, which, as many village signs do in Kent, they do feature hopping. So here you can see a stiltman at work on there, and as well as a horse in there. So hop dermatitis was well known in the hop gardens at the time, as well as hop rash, hop eye and hop wrist. These were all common complaints. But there were also many accidents which occurred in the fields. Other common complaints arose from the living conditions, which were so very different to London, giving some of the hoppers stomach upsets. When horses were used to prepare the hop gardens, they had to have their heads covered to prevent the bine scratching them. So Ethel said there didn't seem to be all the illnesses that there are about now. Although the farmer made us go out in all weathers, you had to keep the fleas and the bugs down. If any of us cried with earache, our mothers filled a pillow with hops to sleep on. I can't remember there being any serious accidents. We used calamine lotion for nettle rashes and such like. We couldn't get rid of the stains from the hops except by hard rubbing with dirt, grass or rainwater. The hardest part was walking in the rain and the mud to the hop fields. If it was wet, we wore any old macks and hats while we were picking, but sometimes we had to pack up early if it rained all day. So this is the Hoppers Hospital in Five Oak Green, which is near Tunbridge again. Father Richard Wilson, he was an Anglican priest from Stepney in London, but so many of his parishioners disappeared to go hop picking that in 1898 he decided to join them. He rented a cottage on the green at Five Oak Green and opened it to the hoppers as a medical centre. It became the first of one of 3 buildings known as the Little Hoppers Hospital. He worked with volunteer nurses attending the sick amongst the pickers, but the building was originally a pub called the Rose and Crown, and when the building was opened as a hospital, they had to put a sign outside saying "No beer here." Today, the building is still linked to Stepney as a religious retreat. This is Hadlow Church Memorial in Hadlow, just outside Tunbridge, and many travellers today still visit Hart Lake Bridge, which you can see on the bottom there on the left-hand side, where they throw a wreath of hops into the River Medway. They're the descendants of the 30 men and women who died on the 25th of October 1853. They were being transported by wagon to their hopping huts after a day's hopping in Hadlow. Their horse lost its footing on the bridge, and their cart crashed through the rotten wooden fence, tipping all the occupants into the River Medway. Of course, no one could swim at that time, and the river was in a state of high flood. The men, women and children were all swept away and drowned. So you can see the memorial on the right-hand side at the bottom there. That's erected in the churchyard to them, and that's recently been restored as the names had faded. One complete family, including the children aged just 2 and 4, were lost in this accident. So now we'll just have a quick look at hopping in the wartime. So people didn't stop when the war came. People probably think they did, but they didn't. But in the 1930s and 40s, war arrived in the hop gardens. Being strafed by machine gun fire as you worked was something the pickers of that time just took in their stride. They dealt with any minor mishaps and then just got on with the main job of picking. People tended to be more independent when little help or resources were available. If a plane came down close by, they were prepared to face an enemy pilot with just a stick or a pitchfork. So a man called R. Vaughan said, "I remember hopping during the war and lying in our tin huts listening to the German bombers going over the channel. Lots of shrapnel fell on our hut roof, and in the morning us kids would go out and collect it. Sometimes it was still warm, and we'd see who could find the biggest piece. It was exciting to us, but not to our poor old mums who must have thought it was hell. But even Hitler didn't stop all the lovely singing and laughter in the hop fields." And then we have an anonymous story, and they've said, "We had finished picking one field of hops and all that was left were the poles and overhead wires. We just moved on to the next field when there was a loud roaring noise and an aircraft came down just above us. It was like this one, a Messerschmitt Me-109, and it landed in amongst the bare wires. The pilot slid back his windscreen and climbed out onto the wing looking very shaky. The hoppers surrounded his plane, holding any bits of wood or implements they could find so he couldn't escape. Suddenly, Dad's army arrived and surrounded the aircraft and the pilot. At first, the pilot was going for his pistol, but then he realised how many hoppers and the Home Guard there were. He thought the better of it, and he and the Home Guard captain saluted each other. The Home Guard marched him off and the aircraft was left up on the wires, which made a natural trap for any enemy aircraft trying to make a landing. So coming to the end really now of hopping time as it was. So this slide is an image of a man called Joseph Chamberlain, and it's from the University Station in Birmingham. Joseph Chamberlain was a very prominent both local and national politician, and in the early 1900s the hop industry came under threat from cheap imported hops. So in 1905 a local man, Frederick Neame of Macknade Farm, Faversham, was asked to represent the hop industry on Joseph Chamberlain's Tariff Reform Committee. This was set up to protect the homegrown hop from the cheap imports. In 1908, everything came to a head when there were massive demonstrations held both locally and in London, and the government finally decided to impose a tax levy on the imported hops of £4 per hundredweight, which of course did help to some extent. But the time is running out, and we're coming to the end of an era really. This is hop picking modern style at Bourton-under-Blean. The mechanical hop picker was invented in Worcestershire and first used in 1934. By 1960, an article in a Kent newspaper claimed that hop picking machines would replace the cockneys, as each machine only required 3 or 4 workers. But of course, in reality, the new machinery and picking by hand, they were really done together initially. They say they even held competitions to see who or what could pick the fastest. So probably as it began, then the machinery would have been slower in the early days, in the beginning, but then the machinery would have improved and the teething issues would have gone, and then it would have been the machine that was faster than the hop picker. So this is Hode's farm in Sandhurst. So a little bit about hop growing today. The Nicholas family and their connections have farmed Hode's farm in the High Weald area of outstanding natural beauty since 1939. They have a farm of 165 acres, of which 101 acres are hop gardens. They also have 15 acres of vines and cherries, plums and other fruit. So if you want to see a real hop garden, the best time is between April and September. From their hop garden, they produce 3 bottled beers: Sandhurst Tradition, Sandhurst Legend and Sandhurst Epic, and they're all produced using the farm's own hops. Today, the national hop acreage has fallen to just over 2,600 acres, but still Kent remains the main producing area. So there are many places that the hop is still celebrated in Kent today. We've got the hop farm at Beltring, which is the home to the hop story, bringing the story of the hop picking to life. We've got the Kent Life at Maidstone, which has an 18th century oast house and a row of hoppers' huts from the 19th century. We've got the International Hop Festival, which takes place every year in Faversham in the first weekend of September. The National Hop Collection is held at Queen Court Farm in Faversham. There's an annual blessing of the hops each year at Canterbury Cathedral. That's in September too. And as they do here in the Brook Museum, many museums hold artefacts to do with hop picking, such as hop tokens and tools that they used in the hop gardens. So that is the end of my talk. I'd just like to say thank you very much to the Brook Rural Museum, also to Philippa Messiano and to Dr. Graham Bradley for their help with this talk. So now it's your turn to ask me any questions if you have any.
So thank you, Sue, for a really fascinating talk and for doing an excellent job of highlighting our Oast House and hop collection. So thank you very much. We have time for a couple of questions if anyone has anything they'd like to ask Sue about hops. Any questions?
Sorry.
I may have missed it, but why was Kent so popular with the hop picking rather than any other county?
With the growing, you mean, or because of the soil here and the fact that we had lots of the Weald of Kent, lots of wood, so hop poles could be obtained easily. The soil was good and the farmers here were very rich.
Can I ask a question? I didn't quite get the hills. You talked about the aisles and the hills. Are hills or are they mounds?
Mounds, really, but in that. Yes, they were originally in rows. Yeah, they were very high. No, the hops were planted. There were poles on top of the mounds, and then the bines were grown up the poles. So they were much higher originally, but then they replaced the hills with just a higher pole, basically. But it was in the days of the local man, the local squire. Scott, that was when the hills were really the thing that was his idea, the hills.
They weren't called mounds, they were called ridges.
All right. Thank you. Has anyone been hop picking? All right, I thought so.
Right, we've got time for one more. Was there a question at that? Yeah.
Yes, I've been hop picking with my mum when I was a young boy at Amos's. just off the A28, and Jennings was there as well. Yeah, every year. We always closed to go back to school when we had to go home.
Was it much like I've just told you? Was that right, that it was like that? Or something like that?
Tough on the hands, and of course it did rain and that, and
Yeah.
you provided your own baskets, and then they would gingerly be shaped into the tally baskets, and you had to make sure the man didn't kick the tally baskets over the
Yeah.
Oh, one more.
My mum used to go on a mission to the hot because when she was at university in London.
Oh, right.
And she had very fond memories of going down to Penston, just as you described.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Thank you.
So one thing you didn't mention, but there were really good fights in the pubs.
No, there's lots of things I could mention, but not all of them are. Yes.
mentioned Washington and Goldhurst, which was a branch line from California, which ran down Hawkhurst. The only time during hot picking, trains ran on that line on a Sunday.
Ah.
Right, okay, I have to call it a day there, but before you go, I just wanted to highlight a couple of our events that are coming up. So our third and final talk will be taking place next month. So on the last Tuesday in March, so the 28th of March, same time, same place here, and the topic is on rebellion in medieval and early modern Kent. And our speaker is Dr. Catherine Byrne, who did her PhD at the University of Kent. So please come along to that. And then another of our events that I have to highlight now is that we're doing a Heritage Hops Festival at the museum in June, on the 10th of June, from 12 to 4. And it's basically an opportunity for you to see our Oast House, to look around the Oast House, see the collection. And also we'll have some live music and a barbecue and some traders who will be selling locally sourced beers, etc. So please do come along. There's flyers at the back of the room, just on the table at the back, if you want to pick something up. And the other thing before you go is all of this that we're doing at the museum this year, we received a grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So basically the reason why this is lovely and free and brilliant is that they're providing us with support. And basically, we really appreciate feedback, and we really need to take that feedback to the Heritage Fund so that they can continue to support the work that the museum is doing. So please, can we have some feedback, anything about this event? And it really helps us to improve our events, and it also really helps us to, as I said, to show the Heritage Fund that we're doing what we said we would do. So you can either, so if you're on the Village WhatsApp, we'll send a link to our feedback form. If you would like it via email, you can just write down your email on a piece of paper at the back I've got prepared, and we'll send you feedback there. Or there is also a piece of paper at the back, so if you just want to write down a quick note about what you thought from talk or anything else, that'd be really, really appreciated. So I just want to say thanks again to Sue for a really great talk, and